Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Bryant.
And I am Erika Lee.
We're back.
We are back.
I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And welcome to our podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance.
Yes, we're so glad that you're able to join us. Our goal here is to disrupt the status quo of racial inequality and inequity in systems. And we hope that each of our episodes, and at this point we're at episode 18,
Yes.
will challenge you to be the change that you want to see.
Yeah. So our topic today is going to be one of those topics that I think it comes up over and over and over again. And sometimes we know what to do with it and sometimes we don't. And so our work today, or our discussion today, and we'd like for you to consider bias. Bias, the silent oppressor that we must confront.
That's good.
Yeah. It
Say
is
that
good.
again.
Bias, the silent oppressor that we must confront.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Silent oppressor.
Yeah. And I think that's aptly termed because it's always there and it creeps up, and very often we don't know what to do about it, and so it continues. And continues, and it marginalizes people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It marginalizes people. So yeah, I think that silent oppressor is really kind of powerful when we think about bias.
Yeah. Because the thing is, we all have it.
Yeah.
You know, like all of us.
All of us.
We talked about that in the previous podcast.
Yes.
And some people want to deny that they have bias, but the reality is we have it because we're primed to have it.
Yeah.
You know, that is just how society is,
That's
you know. So if you notice when you look at television, just for example, you know, who do we see on television? Who gets the leading roles in plays? Who, you know, gets the leading roles in movies? And while there is greater diversity, the diversity tends to be along the lines of gender and race.
Sure.
We don't typically see neurotypical individuals on television. There are few instances. We don't typically see the deaf community on television. There are some situations. And so society primes us to, you know, accept certain things as normal.
That's right. And those groups that you mentioned, the normality that we've accepted is that they are almost like supporting players, if you will, right? So they're there, but they're marginalized. We don't see them a whole lot. So that must mean that in our lives, right, in our daily operations, in our daily interactions with each other, we don't expect to talk to a deaf person. We don't expect to come across a non-neurotypical person. We don't expect to come across anybody who does not fit into the clean images that we see. That's right, all of the time. And when we do, we don't know what to do sometimes. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to consider it. Or we rely on images, very often stereotypical images that we've seen in the past. And that causes challenges. That causes challenges because we really do, like you said, put people in a box, and we have these different categories rather than really sort of, you know, getting to know that person or that group of people on, you know, just in terms of being a human, right?
But interestingly enough, it's not just society itself that primes us, because, you know, we start off with like media. You know, media does do some priming, obviously, but priming tends to happen at super young ages for children by what their families expose them to.
Or don't expose them to.
That's it right there. Yeah, right. So think about when you were growing up, who came over to your house on a regular basis? Who didn't come? Who were your parents' friends? Who were not their friends? Who did you hang out with? Or who were you allowed to hang out with?
That's right.
Who weren't you allowed to hang out with? Think about, because that there,
Yep.
those are some of the early messages.
And they are messages. So
Right.
even if it wasn't, a parent or a grandparent saying, don't hang out, with this group, or we don't, even if they didn't say that, the message around who, the reality
valued.
of who, who was in the circle or not, that's important. And
Right.
those are messages.
They are.
Those are
They
messages.
are messages,
Yeah.
right. And so when we talk about like bias being the silent oppressor, now sometimes bias is not, it's obviously it's an affinity or
Yeah.
preference, and it's not always a bad thing. But when it is a bad thing, meaning someone is being oppressed as a result of your bias,
Right.
then we've got to do something about it.
We do. I just want to give this example. In a previous podcast, I talked about height, right?
Yes.
And so I'm just going to use this example because I think we see it a lot. So, when we look at the presidents of the United States, they're all pretty much tall men.
Yes.
Right? They're all like over 6 feet or something like that. And the truth is that, in our society, we actually associate height with leadership.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if I associate height with leadership, that means that somebody who's shorter, right, who doesn't have the height that I ascribe with leadership, if I have the power to hire a leader or recommend a leader, I'm not going to recommend, because of my bias around height and leadership, I'm not going to recommend anybody who's shorter than I think a leader should be, right?
yeah.
That's a bias.
Right.
And so very often, if we're not aware of that, now it's really about awareness, because once I'm aware of it,
Right.
when I go to recommend or go to hire or go to consider someone for a leadership program, then I know that I have that bias, and I know that I realize that that's a false correlation, right? There are some people who are tall who are not leaders. Conversely, there are some people who are not tall who are, right?
Right,
And
right.
so what I'm going to do is make sure that I check that bias, because now I'm aware of it. And so when we think about oppression and bias, so keeping somebody out of an opportunity to advance to become a leader, that's oppression. We don't give them the opportunity to advance or to be promoted or to be, in the space where they are a leader. So when we think about bias and oppression, that's what we're talking about. And it's really important for us to know and have that awareness of our biases, because we all have them.
But then you also hear negative statements like, that person has a Napoleon complex.
Yes.
And so I remember hearing that as a child, that statement. And what they essentially were talking about was the shorter statured individual who is probably naturally a leader, and has some assertiveness about them, that's shunned.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
so that it's almost like, this person, it's like they ascribe this negative characteristic of leadership. Like, it's like they want something that they don't deserve to have.
That's right. Like, how dare they
Right.
exhibit these leadership characteristics and they aren't 6 feet tall?
Exactly.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
It's I mean, it is absurd
It
when
is.
you think about it.
It is.
Nobody ever pushed back against that narrative
Ever.
when I was growing up.
No,
I
yeah.
never, and
heard
I
it
don't
too.
hear it as frequently now as I did growing up, but it was a big thing. It was like,
was.
so
was.
if you are, shorter in stature and you say something, like you want to assert your
Assert your-
leadership.
that's right.
Like they think you've got an issue.
That's
You've got a
right.
problem.
You've got the problem. You've got the problem. Where if somebody who was 6 feet tall did the same thing, they'd be like, wow, he's really, assertive and sticking up for himself.
And that happens across gender as well.
Sure.
So you might recall some years ago, not that long ago, in tennis, when Serena, threw her
racket.
Her racket. I was gonna say paddle. I was like, nope, wrong game. Wrong game. Threw her racket on the ground, and with an outburst of anger, and they went crazy. How dare she? That's so unprofessional.
Unsportsmanlike conduct.
Rude. And then you pan and you look back and you see a white male doing the same thing. You hear nothing of the sort.
He's passionate.
Right.
He's a passionate competitor.
Right. It's just it's like a different descriptor.
That's right.
Based upon bias.
That's right.
It really is about. So then we've got to confront that bias in society and in in different spaces, in the workplace, in school. So in schools we see bias oftentimes towards students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. We see bias towards students of color.
Yeah.
We see, there's a whole lot of bias that plays out in school, just like it mirrors society.
Yes,
what we see in school mirrors what we see in society.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about confronting it, it takes a bold person to be able to say, I think we need to break up this bias and do something about it.
Yes.
And, in our previous podcast, we talked about allyship, and the change agent of allyship. The change agent is the one that has the power and the authority to really make change systemically, where you might not be the person who can do that, but you can be someone who's either a champion or an influencer to create and precipitate change in society, in schools, in organizations, and even in families.
Absolutely. When I just thought about, you talked about the allyship continuum and the change agent. And when we think about systems, very often we think about sort of the larger system. But you're right. What about the system of a family? Right. What about the system of a professional learning community? What about the system of an office, or a classroom? Those are all systems in and of itself. And so when we think about, being that change agent, when we think about, how much, when I think about how much bias, because as a person of color, like when we talked about fatigue before, like we hear it, we see it, we witness it, we're victims of it, like all the time, right? All the time. And so, but I think being in a space where, once you recognize that it's there, right? Once you recognize that, a group of kids are, even the labels that we give them, an at-risk group of kids, that label. Think about everything that comes along with that.
I hate that label, by the way.
Right.
And I mean, we've talked about this, I think.
Yes.
Maybe not in a podcast.
I don't think in a podcast, but, but
there in our own conversations.
Yes, we just object to some of the labels that we, ascribe and associate with groups based on our deficit lens of that particular group, rather than
our bias.
Or our bias, rather than seeing, the humanity and the value, in that group. And so I think what happens is, we have the opportunity to say something. We have the opportunity. So go back to the Napoleonic complex. This person, is, exhibiting the Napoleonic complex or whatever, say something like, well, that's no different than, or are you saying that he shouldn't be a leader because he's short? Because if so, that's offensive. I think being able to speak up and disrupt those patterns of bias is really important. Is really important in any system.
Yeah. And even so, I was thinking about in a previous podcast when we were talking about privilege, you mentioned how in a store, if you're a deaf person and they make an announcement that could be health related or important or really critical, the individual who is deaf would not hear that announcement. I had an idea. Okay, I don't know if I should say it because I don't know that it's invented, but I wonder if stores and public facilities had a, what do you call it, like a QR code. So when a deaf person enters a facility, they can use their phone, hit the QR code. The QR code then takes them to the site of the, of that establishment. And if there's some kind of announcement or information that they need to know that would typically be made audibly, they now receive it in their phones and they have access to it. It's a good idea, isn't it?
I think that's a very good idea.
Okay, maybe we shouldn't publish that. No.
I think that's a very good idea. I think that's a very good idea. It's like anything that would, and everybody walks in with their phones in their hands, right, or in their, their pockets or whatever. I think that's a really great idea. To even just be able to buzz them,
right,
that something's happening, or we're offering something, or that kind of thing.
Right, we're saying that because the stores or the institutions have a bias, they don't even realize they have it.
That's right.
Because their bias is for those who are hearing. Right.
That's right.
And so, they gear their announcements to the hearing.
Yes. Yes. And that's a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That came to me like the other day. I was like, we need to do, because I think about these things like so what would we do about that? That could be a way to do something.
I think that's
I need
really
to figure out how to make that happen.
Yes, you do.
Okay, don't steal my idea.
That's right.
I said it here.
Right.
I can copyright it by having said it here first,
that's right? Or at least give her a cut.
Yeah, how about that?
of your profits, at least, yeah. So, but I think all of that, right? It just goes back to like, how do we check our bias? So, who are we not considering? And I think in that case, with the example of the stores, like, how do we consider? There's a whole nother group of people that might use our resources, or purchase our product. And how can we consider them more? How can we do a better job? But I think though, going back to like thinking about bias, how do we disrupt it? Very often, we take it on individually. So a lot of what we've talked about is really sort of an individual, like speaking up or, really being aware. I think there's another way though, when we think about like, once you get the group on board, once you get your professional community on board or your office, there are some ways that as a group, you can commit to disrupting bias, right? So we saw, and we're just going to sort of share this, but the Just Work co-founders, Kim Scott and CEO Trier Bryant, they came up with a really great, 3-step framework in terms of disrupting bias. And the first is shared vocabulary.
Right, and that's in the workplace.
Yes,
right.
This is in the
Specifically
workplace.
in the workplace.
This is in the workplace.
Yeah.
Although I think this could work in families.
Oh, it probably.
And I think it could work in groups,
agree with you.
Right?
Yeah.
If we say we're committing to disrupting bias, right? We know what happens when people are marginalized and isolated or victimized through bias. So because of that, we are committed to disrupting bias. There is a way that you can share in that commitment and support each other, because when you know better, you do better, right? Usually. Right. So the first area is really having that shared vocabulary, right? Having that shared vocabulary. And that shared vocabulary is really around, when we notice that when we've heard or seen bias take place, we have a shared way that we will engage in disrupting the bias.
Right. Yeah. So it could be that, we're taking this from the co-founders of Just Work. They talked about like waving a purple flag, like it could be purple flag, which is the signal that I need to share where I've heard a bias taking place.
Yes.
And so that shared vocabulary is really key to being able to like, you've given your coworkers or you've given your family members permission to be able to flag for you when you've said something that is, insensitive or inappropriate or conveys bias. Like there was a term that I will not say that when we were kids, we would use this term often. And, it was a term that was typically used to talk about someone's intellectual capacity. And, somewhere along the lines, that was a word that became flagged. And so I remember, somebody in the family using that term, and the younger generation flagging it without, we didn't have the,
Yes.
there was no purple flag, concept. But the idea was, like, we don't use that term anymore.
Yeah.
That term is derogatory and it is insensitive. And so that it was like, oh, and even pointing it out, the younger generation pointing it out to the older generation. The older generation, had to stop and think, you're right.
Yep.
It's almost like we just took for granted that this was an acceptable way to refer to someone's intellect.
That's right.
And it was powerful because it was like, ooh, there was almost shame from the older generation because they missed it. They missed it, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really good. First of all, to be in a space that's safe enough.
Yeah.
To
that's a key
check somebody,
there.
right? Or to just say, we have this call out, but just calling people in, right? I really love that.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the woman that sort of coined that phrase, but instead of calling people, you call them in, and purple flag or whatever it is we're going to say that flags the biased remark or the or behavior.
Right.
I think is really important, but there's got to be that safety. And so the shared commitment is really part of that commitment is creating the safe space.
Right.
So this is going to be a space that's safe enough for all of us to learn together.
Right.
For
so
us to
you have permission
call
to
people.
tell
That's
me
right.
if I say something
That's right.
that ultimately is offensive.
That's right.
That's
right.
Or reveals a bias that I have.
Yes. Yeah.
And because I've given you permission to do that, and in that shared vocabulary, I'm also going to have a way that I respond to you. So if you flag for me that, Tonya, you said that insensitive word, my response is not going to be like, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean that.
You're taking it out of context.
Right. Like, I can't believe that you coming at me. It's, because we get that.
Yes.
Oftentimes.
Yes,
and so my response is going to be, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Or it could even be, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I would like to be more enlightened on that.
Because I don't understand what the offense was. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think that comes with the shared vocabulary, the shared commitment to disrupting bias.
Right.
And those norms are really important because
Very
the
much
norms
so.
say, how do we then respond because we are so used to responding in defense.
Right.
We're so used to this, to that.
Because we hear that often, like, I didn't mean that.
I didn't mean it
like that. I can't believe they took it that way.
Yeah.
And then it just turns into, it actually spirals
it does.
into something far worse than the
does.
initial statement itself.
Sure.
Because now this person is standing on their ignorance.
That's right.
And like, they now are like, I'm ignorant.
Right.
I'm ignorant, and it's just ridiculous.
It is.
And really what you do is you create this environment, this atmosphere that says that we are going to create a sense of belonging for everyone who is a part of this community, be it a workplace, be it a family.
That's right.
Be it school, the classroom, be it a church.
That's right.
We're going to create a sense of belonging for all members of the community.
That's right.
And if we hear statements that ultimately devalue and diminish who people are, we have this environment that says it's okay to call them in.
That's right.
Using agreed upon language. So you literally may have to sit down as an organization or as a family and come up with that language.
That's right. That's right.
Go through the process of saying, hey, this is how we're going to address issues of offense.
I think that's good.
Or of bias.
I think that's good. I think that's good.
We're going to put a stop to this oppression of different groups of people.
Yeah, and it's so much better when it's that shared commitment, when as a group we decide rather than one person.
Right.
The
young people say, what you're not going to do.
Right.
Like my son is a strong ally, and he is quick for women, for those in the LGBT community, and he's quick to speak against it publicly. Like, He could be in an interview. He could, and what we're not going to do
Right.
is we're not going to devalue
That's
or
right.
dehumanize or other any group
That's
of
awesome.
people because your bias is so, your bias is showing here.
Yes.
I remember having a conversation with a colleague who I had a really good relationship with. And it was, there was safety between us. And I remember her saying something that revealed her bias, but I was able to say to her, your bias is showing, or your privilege is showing. And she received it really well, and it wasn't, it didn't turn into like, how dare you, I believe in all of these things that are good and well and positive. Like, there was no defensiveness on her end, but that came from the relationship that we had.
That relationship is really important.
Yeah.
And I think this strategy of the shared vocabulary, commitment, and norms, it preserves relationships.
It does.
It does.
It does.
And it deepens them, because now I can safely call you in on a biased remark, but then we can also talk about it if you're not sure about, what's happening. And I think that deepens relationships, because now we're in the journey together. Right. And it's not just me fighting, or, it really is sort of this space where we're working together.
Yeah. Have you been in any situations, either, personally or professionally, where you've seen a version of this take place? I don't know that most organizations have, something this concrete, but have you been in any situations where you've seen it, play out?
So the best example was really when I was a teacher. And there was a student that I had who just, her comments around Muslim people who people who follow the Muslim people who follow Islam, and it was derogatory, and I knew that it was just, she just didn't know. I knew that, but she kind of ascribed a characteristic to followers of Islam. And so I just asked her, some people say that Christians are closed-minded. Would you say that all Christians are closed-minded? And she said no. I said, some people say that, white girls are spoiled. Would you say that all white girls are spoiled? And she said no. I said, so we're talking about Muslims, would you say that all Muslims have this characteristic? And she said no. And then I could see it in her face. She was like, thank you. Like, and it was in a class, and I was pretty tight with that class at that point. So we had a really great discussion, but the class was a safe space. And I wasn't calling her, I wasn't being mean about it.
Sure. It was a teachable moment.
It was a very teachable moment. That was probably the best example. But I think there have been times when my kids have, I remember when my kids were in middle school, and there was my one daughter in particular, there was a child who had transitioned from being a girl, and then they wanted to be identified as a boy. So there was a new name and everything like that. And I remember asking my daughter about this particular student who sat at lunch with her every day, and I used the name that I knew, and my daughter said, no, this is his name now. And I said, his name, because I didn't really know, and they were kind of very good friends. So the next time I asked, forgetting about this, I used it, and she said, Mommy, this is the new name now. Like, so if you're going to ask about this person, you're going to have to use his name. And I appreciated that, and it wasn't like, you're homophobic. Like, it wasn't that. It was just like, Mom, you have to remember this. Yeah. This is important to this person.
Sure.
And because of that, it's important to me. And I appreciated you know, her kind of stepping in and not just going along, because I think sometimes we just go along with things.
Right.
And so,
which is
you
why
know,
things don't get confronted.
which is why things don't get confronted,
right.
you know. But again, we had the relationship and it was in the safe space.
Right.
So we would encourage you to really think about some of the things that we talked about today. We did a lot of, you know, we provided a framework around shared vocabulary, commitment, and norms. And we really thank the founders of Just Work for that framework. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we'd love to know, you know, some of your experiences around confronting and disrupting biases in your own systems, in your own workplaces or families or groups that you engage in.
Right. Are there other ways that it might work? Or other styles or practices that you have that might work? That's what we would love to know.
Yeah.
So again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Take care, everyone.